talk series. I'm Andrea Sakosha. I'm the Executive Director of Palisades Village. And on behalf of our events committee, I'd like to welcome you, our members, so many of you we haven't seen in a long time, and it's really lovely to see you, as well as our other village members who are here with us this evening, and they are in for a treat. We are so honored to have our special Palisades neighbors and friends, Evan and Oscie Thomas, return to speak to our village. The last time that they spoke to our village, nearly a year ago, we were just going through COVID, and it was such a delight to have them speak about their New York Times bestseller, First. It was about the life of a first female Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. They're captivating storytellers, and if you haven't had a chance to read their book, I highly recommend it. Tonight, these authors and journalists will have a conversation on presidential leadership. Please join me in welcoming Evan and Oscie Thomas.
Thank you. Great to be back with our neighbors. Thanks for the book plug. I'm going to start out with, I'm going to start out with a musical, Hamilton. I imagine many of you have seen it. Or let's listen to the music. And there was one song in particular which grabbed me called One Last Time. And as you may recall, the scene is that Hamilton is telling George Washington, President Washington, that Thomas Jefferson has resigned as Secretary of State and he's going to run against him for president. And Hamilton is hot to go. We're gonna just kick Jefferson's ass and we're going to beat him. And Washington says, stop, sit down, have a drink. I'm not running again. We're going to have the peaceful transition of power here. I may be the general, but we're done. And he says, we're going to show them how to say goodbye, you and I. And actually, it's just a very moving song. And it captured something that was very unusual in government in those days, the idea of a peaceful transition of power. It was to the same party in that case, but then 4 years later, it happened to the other party. Thomas Jefferson did become president. And Washington is such an admirable figure in his own self-restraint, a great human quality. And I was just reading a terrific book, which I highly recommend to you, called First Principles by Tom Ricks. And it's about the impact of the classics on the founders. And Washington embodied this virtue, embodied the word virtue, which is a word we got from the classics, meaning putting service to your nation over self, service over self. And it's, well, great if you're Washington and you embody it. Of course, the problem is there aren't that many George Washingtons and haven't been in our history. Fortunately, the other founders recognized that this was unusual, and they set up a system of government that had checks and balances to protect us from vanity and ambition and venality and all sorts of things that other people, not George Washington, might have. But there's always been a tension here. For our system will bend and not break, as we've seen. But some of it does depend on the people themselves. And so Oscie and I are going to talk to you tonight about some of the individuals. Some of them had these Washington qualities of restraint, self-restraint, and others did not. And typically some were a mix. So we're going to just talk to you for about a half an hour, a little bit more about this. Oscie, why don't you start us off?
Start with Abraham Lincoln in 1865. He's just been re-elected president, and his second inaugural address is so well known. But let me talk a little bit about it, because the South was just weeks away from its final defeat. There was a lot of pressure right then to punish the South for trying to break away from the Union and insisting on slavery. But Lincoln talked instead about healing, reminding everyone listening to him that we all pray to the same God, and saying, with malice toward none and with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind the nation's wounds. He knew that for the Union to survive, it would have to heal. And And then, as you know, he was assassinated and not able to pick up the promise.
But this idea of healing, we expect it from Lincoln. We don't from Richard Nixon. We forget 1960, Richard Nixon is Vice President of the United States, and he's the one who has to announce his rival's victory to Congress. That's one of the ceremonial roles. We now know this better because of Mike Pence, but Nixon had to be the one to say Kennedy won. And what he said, announcing his own loss, was, in our campaigns, no matter how hard they may be, no matter how close the election may turn out to be, those who lose accept the verdict and support those who won. Nixon actually ran a very clean campaign in 1960. He did not use religion. A lot of people thought he should to get out the anti-Catholic vote, which there was such a thing back in 1960. He very purposely did not do that. And most scholars now think that 1960 election was stolen from him. I hesitate to use the word stolen, but if you look at Chicago and you look at Texas, I think most people really, who I've recently been reading about this, really look hard at the evidence. The Democrats, the Daley machine in Chicago and the LBJ's machine in Texas did hand the election to Kennedy. At the time, Nixon went along with this because we were in the middle of a Cold War and he didn't want to challenge it and have us go on for months and months and months. And so he accepted it gracefully. Now, the problem is Nixon is Nixon, and he was bitter about it. And he said, when 1968 rolled along, the Kennedy campaign, they were pretty dirty. Dick Tuck and Paul Corbin, he had all these operatives. We're not going to let that happen again. We were outfoxed in 1960, not in 1968, not in 1972. And of course, those were the seeds of Watergate, because Nixon ultimately, although he was gracious in 1960, he just was embittered by it.
So we're going to fast forward 40 years to the Bush-Gore election, the 2000 election, which we actually also wrote about in the Sandra Day O'Connor biography. As you'll remember, the last state, the key state was Florida. And initially, the Florida had been called for Bush, and Gore actually called George Bush to concede. Then he called back when his staff told him the vote was really too close. And he said, no, I'm withdrawing my concession. We're going to wait and see how this goes. And as you know, there was a machine recount that went for Bush again, and then they started the fight over hand recounts that ultimately went to the Supreme Court twice. But finally, and I'll interject a little bit to tell you, for those of you who thought that the Supreme Court's ruling was put Bush in the presidency, it's actually not the case, because 3 media recounts occurred, and including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. I apologize for my phone, I should have turned it off. The Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, they put a multi-million-dollar effort into actually recounting those very votes with the help of accounting firms. And they discovered that Bush barely won in any event. But Gore finally conceded on December 13th with grace and humor. And he said in his speech, I called George Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd president of the United States. And I promised him that I wouldn't call him back again. So he went on to talk about unity in the country and the strength of our democracy. And his intent, even though it took a long time, his intent was to tell his bitter supporters to help the new president lead the nation, and that he would help him as well.
These men and women are human, and they don't necessarily have to like each other. I was struck that Eisenhower and Truman when they were on their way up to Eisenhower's inauguration, they ride together. Not this time, but they usually ride together from the White House to Capitol Hill. Eisenhower and Truman didn't speak to each other because Eisenhower was mad at Truman because he believed that Truman had been spreading rumors about Eisenhower's alleged affair with Kate Summersby in World War II. So the point is that they did have a peaceful transition. They didn't like each other. They don't even have to speak to each other, but their machinery of their two administrations was still allowed to merge, whatever their human feelings were.
I enjoyed working with Evan on his book about Eisenhower called Ike's Bluff. It was really interesting. And recently I've read Susan Eisenhower's book about her grandfather, which I also recommend, called How Ike Led. He had tremendous confidence when he arrived in the Oval Office, and he had already been Supreme Commander of Europe. So he kept a diary, and the first night he's in the White House, he writes in his diary that there are plenty of worries and difficult problems, but nothing I haven't faced before. He was ready to be president, and he led for a peaceful 8 years once we were quickly out of the Korean War.
Eisenhower was ready to be president. Harry Truman, not at all. It was almost criminal how unprepared he was by FDR, who did not tell Truman about the Manhattan Project, didn't tell him about the atom bomb. He only spoke to him twice between the time he was inaugurated and the time he died in April 1945. And FDR knew he was dying. Truman had to learn on the job. And the great thing about Truman was that he was modest enough to know what he didn't know and to listen to others for advice. He said in his self-effacing way, I may not have a lot in the way of brains, but I appoint people who do. And in his case, it made a lot of difference because the United States in 1945 wanted to come home after World War. They won World War II, and we were an isolationist country. We were still an isolationist country. The labor unions, wanted to come home. And as Averell Harriman said, Americans just want to come home, go to the movies, and drink Coke. Harry Truman, who might have been inclined that way, realized that we couldn't, because he talked to people who knew better. He formed this very unlikely alliance with Dean Acheson. To think of it, Harry Truman, a failed haberdasher from Kansas City, went to a commercial college for I think about 6 months, and Dean Acheson of Groton and Yale, totally culturally different, stylistically different, and yet became fast friends in the cause of saving the world. That Truman listened to this small group of men, in those days they were men, who said America can't come home. We really don't have a choice. Russia's on the march. Europe has collapsed. We have to rebuild it. And Truman listened to these folks and had the modesty when we were rebuilding Europe, and Clark Clifford said to him, well, we should need to call this the Truman Plan. Harry Truman said, no, let's call it the Marshall Plan, because General Marshall, the Secretary of State, was a more popular figure. And Truman knew that if they called it the Truman Plan, that would hurt it in Congress. So Truman had the political wisdom and the modesty to call it the Marshall Plan, obviously the greatest bit of foreign policy ever tried. Where we basically rebuilt Europe and a rare government program that was on time and came in your budget and saved the possibilities of freedom. As we were building up our defenses, we were rebuilding Europe. And that was because Truman was willing to listen, not to his political advisors necessarily, but to these men who knew the world better than he did.
I love this story from David Michaelis's new book about Eleanor Roosevelt, that when FDR died, she called Truman and he said to her, what can I do for you? And she said, no, Mr. President, what can I do for you? For you're the one in trouble now. So she understood what a challenge he had. And I think she understood how little prepared her husband had left him.
Yeah.
That wasn't true when Truman turned the office over to Eisenhower. Even though he didn't like him, he had left in a locked drawer in the office a chilling report from a group of scientists about Soviet nuclear intentions and how many atom bombs, not hydrogen, but atom bombs, these scientists thought the US might survive. The answer was 2,500, but survival, they said, would have, quote, a rather specialized meaning.
Eisenhower's great triumph was keeping us out of war. I mean, the great warrior who had conquered Europe, after he got us out of Korea, the United States did not lose another combat troop for the rest of his 2 terms. No other president has that record. Eisenhower is a very interesting example of quality, what I think is the greatest quality in leadership when we see it. And that is the confidence to be humble. Eisenhower was so confident that he could afford to be humble. I mean, often we find the reverse is true in life, that arrogant people are actually insecure. Eisenhower was the reverse of that. And it's not that he didn't have a big ego, he had a giant ego. You don't conquer Europe and be called Supreme Allied Commander without having a big ego. He did, but he learned how to control it. And his temper, he had a huge temper, but he learned how to control it. When he was a little boy, mom kept him from trick-or-treating, and he got so mad he smashed his fists against a tree until they were bloody. And his mother, who was very religious, read scripture to him. He who conquereth his own soul is greater than he who conquereth the city. And Eisenhower remembered that. And self-restraint, self-control, something that is not notable in modern politics, was a kind of a byword for Eisenhower. And he showed it again and again. It was subtle. He got criticized, for instance, for not attacking Joe McCarthy, the demagogue who was on the loose. And Eisenhower had the good judgment to know that if he got into as he put it, a pissing match with a skunk, it wasn't going to work. Instead, he worked subtly behind the scenes to undermine him. It took a while. It took 15 months, but he did. And it finally brought McCarthy down by being subtle about it. Sorry, our daughter just arrived and set up the burglar alarm. Sorry. Sorry, we're doing a TV thing. He also did it on civil rights. Again, very low key. Eisenhower got heavily criticized for being slow on civil rights, but he felt the country had to do it slowly and carefully, and he did subtle things. He appointed federal judges who were going to appoint civil rights. And when it was time to actually enforce the law in Little Rock, when Orwell Faubus, the governor, was refusing to let Black school kids go to school, high school, Eisenhower didn't fool around. He sent in the 101st Airborne, not the National Guard. He sent in the airborne with bayonets. He meant it. So when he gave his word, he meant it. He knew when not to boast, when not to show off, but when he had to be serious, he was serious.
Apologies. Eisenhower kept the military spending down in the country. There were claims that the Air Force was making, and Joe also in his column was hyping that there was a missile gap with the Soviets, but Eisenhower knew that was wrong. He had the U-2 flights going over the Soviet Union. We knew that they were behind, not ahead. And he did call privately also the lowest form of animal life on Earth. That's a bit earthy. But he wasn't publicly rattled. Kennedy used this fact that Eisenhower was rather dismissive as a way of saying, well, he's an old guy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. There is a missile gap, and that Nixon and Eisenhower weren't paying attention and the US had fallen behind. So Kennedy came in cocky and obviously not knowing what he didn't know.
He'd been a senator for 8 years and he was well-traveled, but his kind of flip attitude got him into trouble right away in the Bay of Pigs. Huge fiasco of a CIA-backed invasion of Cuba that was driven into the sea. And when he was done, it was interesting. He asked Eisenhower to meet him up at Camp David. It was the first time Kennedy had ever been to Camp David. And Eisenhower patiently started quizzing Kennedy about how it all went wrong at the Bay of Pigs. And he discovered that when Kennedy came into office, Eisenhower had a very elaborate bureaucracy for national security planning. It was very military. Eisenhower had a saying that plans are nothing, but planning is everything. And Kennedy's view was, who needs all this planning? I'm going to hire Mac Bundy, the Harvard dean, and get my buddies down here, and we're going to wing it. And they got themselves into trouble. And specifically, Eisenhower found out that Kennedy, when he was planning for it, had never gotten everybody into one room so he could hear people disagree. Instead, he talked to people one by one. And generally, people want to please the president and tell him what he wants to hear. And so he didn't get the full picture. He didn't hear the different groups disagree with each other. He didn't realize, for instance, that when the Joint Chiefs of Staff signed off on the Bay of Pigs, what they really meant was, well, it's a CIA project. It's not our responsibility. They weren't saying it was military, it was a good idea. They were just saying, let the CIA worry about it. Kennedy didn't understand that. Now, he learned from his experience. He really did. He got a lot better at it, but he had to learn on the job in a painful way. He did one thing that was particularly great about the Bay of Pigs. When it was a fiasco, he came out to the press and he said, victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. I am responsible. I am the responsible officer. Very unusual for a politician to actually take full personal responsibility. He did. And you know what? His approval rating went up to 85%, one of the highest approval ratings ever. Mm-hmm. The public really appreciates it in that rare case when a politician actually takes responsibility. He also deserves credit for getting people to go into public service by that famous inaugural address. But
young people flocked to public service. He was a new generation, as he said, and that was a tremendous thing. His inaugural was dramatic and memorable. You probably remember it if you were around and an adult then. He was speaking to citizens and allies and foes, but in the way that can happen when speech writing and rhetoric becomes too much an end in itself, he pledged too much. And he said that America would pay any price, bear any burden, support any friend to assure the success of liberty.
Now, Kennedy may have understood that this was rhetoric, that this was Ted Sorensen and all that. But his successor, Lyndon Johnson, was a little bit too literal-minded about it and overread it, did not appreciate the nuances, wanted to live up to the legacy of the assassinated president without really knowing what Kennedy's intentions were. Now, I should say Kennedy's intentions on Vietnam remain vague. Historians are still uncertain what Kennedy would have done. But we do know, unfortunately, what Johnson did do, and that is to get in with both feet and to escalate. It's always a problem. Rhetoric, big rhetoric, can get you into big trouble. There's always been a tension in American foreign policy between our idealism and our realism. It's a healthy tension, but sometimes our idealism can carry us too far. The realist can go too far the other direction. But getting this balance right is hard, and Johnson didn't, not in Vietnam. He did in civil rights. That's where his idealism actually, and he'd been a realist before, just to reverse the play here, he'd been, a Southern senator, a member of the anti-civil rights caucus as a senator, but as president, he embraced civil rights. And if you want to be moved, go on YouTube and look at his speech on the Voting Rights Act. This is a case of a speech really making a difference, and it'll make you cry. It was a speech written by Richard Goodwin, an old Kennedy speechwriter, but it was delivered.
Doris Kearns Goodwin's husband.
Delivered by Johnson, and it had that great. He used a line from the Negro spiritual, "We shall overcome," and said, and this was a hard thing for a Southern Texan to do in 1965. He said on the floor of the of Congress to a joint session, he said, "We shall overcome," and it just changed everything. It got it done. Got voting rights done and civil rights done.
Yeah, George H.W. Bush is someone we wanted to talk about a little bit because when he became president in 1988, it took a little while for him to develop he had a real confidence, but it took a little while for him to find his footing. But he's the best example of humility because the Soviet Union collapsed under his watch. And when the Berlin Wall came down, he was gracious. And he told his staff who wanted to make political hay out of it, we're not going to gloat. He didn't want the Soviets to feel like we were dancing on their demise, as it were. And John Meacham's biography of George H.W. Bush is very affecting, and there are parts in it will also make you cry or made me cry. Ronald Reagan, his predecessor, had started a tradition that's been followed by every president since, including Donald Trump, of leaving on the Oval Office desk a cordial letter for his successor. Joe Biden hasn't released Trump's letter, but he did say that it was a very generous letter. Trump's behavior has otherwise, both before and after the election, broken every norm for presidential succession, leading to the assault on the Capitol. But we will wait and see and hope that we move past that part of our history and return to more sure times when presidential succession transfers peacefully and power is shared. So we welcome questions and answers. We'll welcome questions.
Answers too.
Well, we might have some answers. You might have some answers.
Does anyone have questions? Just feel free to unmute yourself or.
Okay, I do. Thank you very
Sharon.
much.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi, good to see you. I guess the one person you didn't address was Joe Biden. And I'd be very interested to know what you think about how he fits into your paradigm of various models of presidential leadership. I know it's very early in his tenure as president, but he's also somebody who's been around for a long time. And I think you certainly must have some ideas about his general style and inclinations. And I'd love to hear what you think that means about how you expect him to display leadership as president.
Sure. I mean, it's early days, but one thing about him jumps out, and a lot of this is timing and luck, getting the right president for the right moment. And one thing that Joe Biden has, which is really necessary for the country, is decency. He's a decent human being. I'm sure he's not perfect, nobody is, but he radiates a certain kind of decency. And at this particular moment in history, when his predecessor was at various times indecent, that's a very good thing. Now, the question is, how much of a backbone does Biden have? Can he stand up to the various interest groups all around him? He owes a lot. He comes from a world of the U.S. Senate where it's trading favors and saying yes, and that's good to get. Compromise is good, and I'm one of the people who thinks it's good that he was good that he worked with Senator Eastland and conservative Democrats back in the day, and people are all upset about that. But it shows that he was willing to make deals, and I think we live in an age when you have to make deals. The question is he too plowed? Is he gonna stand up to people or not? And it's too early to know. I wish this bill that they're about to vote on had been a bipartisan bill, but their argument is that we didn't have time for that. We need to get this aid out there quickly. That's a plausible argument, and it may forcing them to go the purely partisan route, 50, straight 50 vote. Again, I wish that wasn't the case, but there will be other opportunities to try to be bipartisan, to try to revive that spirit, which is pretty much dead in Washington. And if anybody can do it, I think Biden is probably somebody who can. The other thing I will say about him is that he, as a senator, talked too damn much. I mean, he almost had logorrhea. He almost had a medical condition. He just couldn't shut up. I think he's been much better about that. About kind of.
Kevin used to cover the Congress.
I knew him back in 1981. I covered Congress for Time magazine. In those days, we had a lot of access, and Biden had a lot of free time. So I really spent some time with him, and he just talked too much. He's been bad. I sort of appreciated and kind of laying low. He's in trouble for not giving a press conference. Press is mad at him. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think his relative restraint has been a good thing. And he conveys, I'm going to shut up here, but he conveys a sort of genuineness that I think at this particular moment in history is a good thing.
I think this is going to be what a challenge he has as president, or anyone who in that office right now, coming out of a pandemic, coming behind a moment where the country seems so riven, and coming with climate change issues and also just economic issues that will unfold. So we have a friend who doesn't live in the Palisades. He's in Cleveland Park, Steve Pearlstein. He won the Pulitzer Prize for his columns on economics. He wrote his last column today, and it is very powerful. Steve is a liberal, and he is for, economic, higher taxes and some economic redistribution, but he warns, and it's with respect to this bill that is passing through the Congress right now, but generally about this view that we have in modern monetary policy, that we actually don't need to worry about deficits, and the stock market will always go up and there won't be inflation. So go find Steve Pearlstein today. There won't be any more. It's his farewell.
It's a really good column about the magical thinking that seems to have taken over government. I mean,
that will make Joe Biden's job a lot harder if Steve is right. And there is a reckoning in Biden's presidency. Do you know, will someone ask the questions? We see some coming in, but we can't.
I was just going to. How confident are you of future peaceful transfers of power, and why?
Well, we sure tested it this last time. It doesn't get much worse than an invasion of the Capitol. And I am bothered. The one thing I have two reactions. One is that our system worked brilliantly. That despite all the allegations and the lawsuits, the courts were, 63-1 or something like that.
For 90 cases.
So the system, our electoral system worked brilliantly, and that was hugely reassuring. The rule of law worked, and that was hugely reassuring. But there are a couple of things that bother me. One is these numbers that show such a high percentage of Republicans and Trump supporters believing that the election was stolen. Those numbers move around a little bit, but they're big. Half, 2/3, something like that of Republicans or Trump supporters. That's a disturbing number, that so many Americans have lost such faith in the system that they just don't believe it. That bothers me. There's even some numbers of significant numbers of people who accept the violence of storming the Capitol. That bothers me. Yeah. That I think that the January 6th thing was not so bad. Whoa. What are those? Where are those people coming from? This goes to the issue that people have talked a lot about, the loss of faith in American institutions. I have a lot of faith in American institutions, and I think it was justified by the electoral process. But if you look at the numbers, now this is a bit of a false game because I always start the numbers in 1963 when faith in institutions was the highest in the Kennedy year. 1963, people believed in Congress, the law, courts, even the press, business. Those numbers are the sort of 60, 70% in 1963 are down at 10% and 12% today. People have just lost faith in institutions, all institutions, with the exception of the military, actually. There still is pretty high faith in the military, but every other institution, press, Congress, you name it, lawyers, in the tank. That is a disturbing, because you have to have some faith in your institutions. It's the social glue of democracy. You can't just do it by laws that are written on books. There have to be customs and understanding and forbearance and some faith is involved.
I think we are impressed that the courts performed as well as they did. And in a way, it's fortunate that the Supreme Court was asked several times to take up the issue of the election and refused. Even with the 3 Trump nominees. And I just think that branch of our government was terrific and has held up and will hold up and that's important.
I have a ton. We just finished, Oscie and I just finished working on a book about a Supreme Court justice, and we spent a lot of time in the files of the Supreme Court justice.
We had Sandra Day O'Connor's permission to have access to her records from the court.
For 10 years, from 1981 to 1991. So we saw an awful lot of paper. The arguments between the justices are very principled. They're very technical, but there's not log rolling and horse trading and vote trading. I mean, there are hints of that, but really, not really. Well,
No,
not really. I
they're
mean,
not.
there's
They're-
politics. There are some politics. But basically, the point is, it's a very high-minded exercise. When you see the way they work through a case on affirmative action or abortion or any of these big issues, it's extremely principled and scrupulous. And obviously the liberals are more likely to vote the liberal way and the conservatives are more likely to vote the conservative way. But the argument itself is very principled.
If you have a moment, I just wanted to ask you to speculate a little further on JFK. I remember all the idealistic rhetoric from being an intern, and he spoke to interns on the White House lawn. But certainly it was a learning experience for him. And after the Bay of Pigs, with the experience of the Cuba crisis, where he consulted more and was very prudent. I'm just wondering what your guess would be on that question of Vietnam. He seemed to be taking a more moderate position on a more prudent one. Would he have maybe made a different course of action than LBJ?
I think so. I think Oscie may. I think so, but I have to guess that because we don't know. There's conflicting evidence on this. He famously said that he worried that Vietnam would be like drinking. You take one drink and it makes you want to have another. And that once the escalade started. Now, against that, he was a very political creature and he didn't want to be blamed for losing Vietnam. Remember, we forget, but losing China was a terrible allegation. And he was worried in 1964 that if he went soft on Vietnam, he would pay for it with not getting reelected for a second term. So he was sensitive to allegations about going soft on communism and losing Vietnam. Nonetheless, it is my guess that he would have seen how this was going to turn south on him and found a way not to get committed the way Johnson did, partly because he was a very sophisticated guy. JFK was a very sophisticated guy about foreign policy, more so than LBJ was very sophisticated about domestic politics, getting bills, but not so sophisticated about the larger issues of U.S. foreign policy. He just wasn't, and got himself into trouble, got us into trouble.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I have a question, Kate Perry, a little bit off topic. I hope you don't mind, but that happens.
Sure.
The revelation this past week about all the audio tapes of Lady Bird, I'm absolutely fascinated by that. And this is probably something that you academic scholars have known about. Somehow I missed it. Are you at all intrigued by that? Are you thinking you might start focusing?
I don't know
feel
about it.
dumb.
I feel stupid. I don't even tell us about it. I should know all about this, but I don't. Tell
Oh,
me.
well, it was in the Washington Post just a couple of days ago. And she apparently did an audio diary virtually every day of her husband's tenure as president, commenting, and it demonstrates, according to the Post, the fact that she had a very real influence and was extremely involved in at least his speeches.
Yeah.
And I assume probably that also meant some of his policy statements. I'm just very intrigued by it. I've always thought, and I bought, but I haven't read the biographies of LBJ. I didn't find him particularly appealing as a person, but I'm fascinated by his knowledge and ability to maneuver on Capitol Hill. And I've always wondered, because Lady Bird always seemed a very savvy individual, although again, I know nothing about her.
Oh, I think you're right about that.
I do know something about this. Actually, there's a book coming out. So this is ringing a bell now. But it confirms what you said, that Lady Bird, super smart, super savvy, always was a close advisor. She's a tragic figure in a way, because LBJ was so, what's the word for it? Piggish, I think is the right word. He was just
Disgusting.
terrible about,
Yeah.
oh God, I mean, his personal life was a mess, and she knew it, and she put up with him and was faithful and loyal to him through what no woman after should put up with. But she did it. She obviously recognized redeeming qualities in him, but also because she had some power. He listened to her. She was very much involved in his speech making, and he talked to her about everything.
You can hear
And-
this, and Michael Beschloss edited the LBJ tapes, and remember, those were supposed to be closed for 50 years, and she worked with
This is a
Harry,
good
what's
story.
his last name?
Middleton.
Who was head of the LBJ library in Austin at the University of Texas, and they agreed that he would look better to the public if these tapes were released at about year 25 or
Yeah,
so.
I mean, it was interesting. LBJ wasn't doing too well in public opinion polls, and Middleton, but also Lady Bird
Lady
had
Bird,
the
she
good
had to
judgment
agree.
that the raw Lyndon, talking about his pant size and all that stuff, would actually help his.
And it did.
And it did. That Beschloss book about
It's great.
is fantastic, and Johnson went up in his standing in the historical polls, because it showed how he's, yes, a crude guy, but very capable at twisting elbows and getting things done, and subtle. There were a lot of nuances about Vietnam, for instance.
Yeah.
And the Lady Bird shows up in those.
She does, and actually, I listened to them, the audio tapes. So you hear the Johnsons, and then Michael will interject the context, and so you hear Johnson. He gives a speech. One of his first calls is to Lady Bird. Bird, he'd say, "How'd I do?" And instead of, I mean, a lot of husbands or wives want to hear, "You were fabulous."
Yeah.
No matter what you think your role is, to say you were fabulous. But she
No.
would not do that. She would say, "Well, about 10 minutes in, you started veering off, and I really didn't think that was what you want to do." And he was listening closely because she was his advisor. So yeah, she
Yeah.
was really important to him. And even though he wasn't faithful or a good husband, he had a connection with
just
her.
to broaden this point, I mean, when we think of presidents and their spouses, how critical this is. I mean, Rosalind was really important to Jimmy Carter. Eleanor was really important to FDR, but the emotional distance was a problem, and they were kind of running two presidencies. Nixon, so complex. Pat was very important to Nixon early on, bucking him up, giving him good political advice. one of the reasons why the wheels fell off the the Nixon presidency was that Nixon stopped talking to Pat. That H.R. Haldeman, who was otherwise in many ways a very good chief of staff, separated Pat out, left her stranded out there in the East Wing. And Nixon did, and for instance, Pat's advice was destroy the tapes. If Nixon had only listened to Pat, he would have been a two-term president. But he didn't. He didn't. By then, he wasn't paying attention to what his own wife said. And that cost him. And I think actually, once he was out of office, he realized he'd blown it by not paying more attention to his wife.
We have another question in the chat. Can you speak to the leadership qualities of George W. Bush and compare his presidency as compared to his father's?
Well, that's a tough question because it's so colored by the fact that George W. Bush felt his father's shadow in ways that were positive and negative. George H.W. Bush was a great role model for George W. Bush in many ways. It was particularly this thing we talked about, the confidence to be humble, that was a Bush family characteristic, that you're supposed to not show off too much and not brag too much. And at some level, W understood that. But, and there's always a but, at the same time, W was rebelling against his father. And so he did show off sometimes, and he did swagger, and he did do some of that stupid stuff that, hang him dead or alive, that got us into trouble.
Or finish the war his father started.
Finish the war his father started. So it's a mixed bag, I think. I think that W does
succeeded in. But
W does have some of the qualities of his father, of sort of decency, but his insecurities got to him and led him and influenced his decision making in ways that were bad for all of us.
I do think as post-president, George W.
Brilliant.
Has been so smart. And George H.W. Bush was able to go across party lines, become close to Clinton. He couldn't believe the country had voted for Clinton, whom he didn't have a lot of respect for initially, but he came to become his friend. And George W. Bush had the ability to be bipartisan when it mattered.
George W., the Republican Party was evolving.
Yeah.
And not in a good way, going further right and more populist. And, George H.W. is sort of the last of the moderate, even liberal New England Republicans. I know George H.W. Bush was from Texas, but he was, at least half of them was from Connecticut, by the time W comes along, it's all Texas. And he's a cruder, harsher, further conservative guy. With some important exceptions, compassionate conservatism got to try. But the party itself had gone further right, and I don't think that helped W.
Yeah.
Alec, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. A quick question. I think Julia Swag is coming out with a book on Lady Bird next week.
Yeah, I think that's what this is a reference to. I think I'd forgotten. I think I've looked at that book. Did I? Yes. And there is interesting stuff in there about, this is coming back to me now, about Lady Bird's role. It confirms what we knew about her.
Yeah.
But there's interesting detail that shows just how involved she was.
I wanted to ask another question though. The Bay of Pigs plan was organized, if I'm not wrong, under the Eisenhower administration. And so it was moving forward already before Kennedy came in. And
This is true.
would have had to stop it in some way. Not to say his proclivities were different, because all those people in those days were so anti-Castro. Remember all the things they tried to do to eliminate him. But I just wonder how that conversation between Eisenhower and Kennedy went when Kennedy said, "Ike, what the hell were you doing?"
There's a lot of truth to that. It grew that winter of 1961, it grew from a smaller operation to a bigger operation under Kennedy. And it was really Richard Bissell, who had been the director of operations in the Eisenhower administration. He's talking to Kennedy before the election. Bissell is, and Eisenhower is guilty of not paying close enough attention. Ike was at the end of his 2 terms. He was ill. He was playing a lot of golf. He just took his eye off the ball, and that operation got away from him. I don't think he would have done it, because I think he would have talked closely to the military guys who would have seen that, who did see, but didn't really protest enough, because it was going to be a disaster, especially when they moved the landing site. They moved it once, they cut out the air cover. It was a military hopeless operation. Ike, I'm sure, would have seen that.
Thank you.
Mute us again.
Any more questions, or we'd love one more question if you have one, and
I got a question. Terrific.
Ben,
Ben,
What do you guys
you're not from the Palisades, Ben, but you're allowed to ask a question.
from this outside, what do you foresee as the relationship between the press and the Biden crowd? You know, they were at Trump's neck, understandably. Now, are they going to be fawning over Biden, or are they going to do
Well, my flip answer is eventually they'll turn on Biden, because they always do. I mean, it's sort of I say this both cynically but also admiringly. It's the job of the press is to be the check on the president, and history will tell you that eventually they do. Right now, they're giving Biden pretty much of a free pass. They're not closely questioning this $1.9 trillion bill, which I think has got a lot of problems. We mentioned the Steve Pearlstein column. People really should read that, because in that column, he takes the press to task, saying that, everybody hated Trump so much, and they were so engaged in that they just, once Biden came in, they stopped and did not have not exposed, delivered the same level of scrutiny to Biden that they anywhere near that they did to Trump, because for all the obvious reasons. I think that'll probably change, but I wish the press would be a little bit tougher. I wish the press would be a little tougher on Biden now. I think he's getting too much of a free pass.
Don't you think the fact checker has been pretty hard on Biden?
Well, this fact checker, but I don't think anybody's really paying any attention. That's what they do. Fact checkers do that.
Right,
And,
but I mean,
you know.
that's in the Post.
That's supposed, but generally, the press has been pretty friendly to Biden. I have mixed feelings about this. I'm friendly to Biden. If I was still a reporter, I would want to give him a break too, because I thought, Trump was bad for the country, and I think Biden is basically good for the country. So I understand the impulse to want to give Biden a honeymoon and to root him on. But I was struck by my friend Steve's column this morning, that I thought he had some good points, that the press could be a little bit tougher right now and a little more gimlet-eyed. Is that the right word?
Steve was specifically
talking
talking about the
this
economics.
1.9 trillion stuff. There's a lot of junk in there, and I won't rephrase his argument.
Go read it.
Go
Yeah.
read it.
Yeah, they've been.
Thank you, everyone, our neighbors.
Thank you,
We
neighbors.
love living in the Palisades.
Will you come back and speak with us again?
If you ask
you have
us,
something
if
to
you have
talk
something to
about.
say.
Well, I'm greedy anyway, and this has been thoroughly enjoyable and so interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank
Sure.
you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much. and
Bye, all.
Good night, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Yeah.
Good night.
Thank you,
you.
Sharon.
Oh, that was